across America. Live, this is Point of View. And now, Kerby Anderson.
Thank you for joining me. It is the Thursday edition of Point of View. First hour, we're going to look at a lot of issues in the news. First off, looking at what is going on in Iran, seeing if we can, if nothing else, try to sort out some of the misinformation, the claims and counterclaims. And I think you'll find this first article by Jim Garrity to be very helpful in that regard. Then I do want to focus a little time and attention on the California election system for a couple of reasons. First of all, it's still in the news. They're still counting votes. But more importantly, the Wall Street Journal has a piece really trying to counter some of the comments that President Trump has made. On the other hand, we also have a very good piece that I've posted by our friend John Funn about what could be done to fix California's broken election system. And before we wind down in this first hour, I'll also go to a very good piece by our friend Victor Davis Hanson. Next hour, we're going to get into a piece written by Christopher Reese, which I think you're going to appreciate. And then a new movie out by Hormoz Shariat, more a documentary on Islam and radical Islam. On the one hand, talking about the threat of Islam. On the other hand, pointing out the number of Muslims who are becoming Christians. So we'll get into some of that in the second hour. If we don't cover all of that today, I've already put together all the articles for tomorrow's Friday weekend edition. Liberty McCarter and Jeff Mateer will be with us, and we'll cover a lot of topics then. But Jim Garrity puts it this way, you know what, now we see Iranian strikes, American counterstrikes. Doesn't look like much has changed in a time in which supposedly we had a ceasefire. Put that in scare quotes because that's not happening. But what he did is pulled together what he calls 5 extraordinary developments in the Iranian war. Because you get these claims back and forth. Those who are on the legacy media don't like Donald Trump almost seem like they don't want to believe that we've been successful in Iran in the Iranian war. On the other hand, let's face it, this president is prone to over-exaggerate, engage in hyperbole. So the first point Jim Garrity makes is, look, on Sunday night, Iran fired nearly 30 ballistic missiles at Israel. Now, he points out that in the fog of war, no one knows precisely how many missiles Iran still has, how many are remaining, what kind of capability that Iran has to actually manufacture some more. But I think you can get the point that when you've been hearing from the president, we've completely devastated their ability to fire missiles, and then 30 missiles come firing from Iran into Israel. Okay, obviously they had at least 30. And of course, we'll also talk about the fact that on Tuesday night there was a combination of missiles and drones. So let's go to some possibly reliable sources. One would be the Congressional Research Service. Back in March, said even then that Israel and U.S. officials have stated varying estimates on the production of ballistic missiles. Israel estimated that Iran was producing dozens of ballistic missiles per month. The Secretary of State at that time, Marco Rubio, said that Iran was producing about 100 missiles a month. Another was saying about 50. But nevertheless, the bottom line is, let's first acknowledge that you can make all the statements in the world that we have destroyed the military in Iran, but even if we have destroyed many of the missile manufacturing facilities and destroyed many of the missile launch sites, apparently there are still many that are working or have been refurbished in the time. And again, we also recognize that if you go to some of the conversation from the president when he was with, before he walked out, Meet the Press with Christian Welker, he says, I know the number of ballistic missiles. I know where their drone factories are. And of course, the whole question is, are we going to continue to bomb Iran and bomb missile production factories and drone factories? And the answer seems to be yes. Now, again, when you look at some of these various strikes, for example, that came on Tuesday, those strikes targeted about 21 different sites, mostly at U.S. bases across the region. And again, a source of some concern. U.S. Central Command did not immediately confirm the attacks, but Kuwait's military reported intercepting some of those aerial attacks, and Jordan's armed forces said they intercepted 5 missiles from Iran. So Iran still has missiles, still has the capability of launching them. We have, I think, a better word, degraded the military in Iran. The president loves to say we've completely destroyed them. I think that is an over-exaggeration, as evidenced by the fact that missiles still seem to be flying. That's number one. Number two, when we talk about missiles, now we want to move to a drone, and one of the Iranian drones took down a U.S. Army Apache helicopter. It's a gunship that was patrolling the Strait of Hormuz off the coast of Oman. Now, in this particular case, this is amazing. Both pilots were rescued. In a minute, I'll talk about how they were rescued by using an unmanned drone vessel. Just amazing. The kind of military capability the United States has. But nevertheless, if you followed some of that, this particular drone, I believe, if I got the facts right, landed between them. They were able to bring it down to the water, survive at a point in time, and then eventually get rescued. Which brings me to my third point, and then we'll take a break. And that is they were actually saved. They were rescued by an unmanned drone, and this is what is called the Autonomous Corsair Maritime Drone. It was built to find and recover individuals. In this case, it was able to find and recover the 2 of those individuals who were stranded near the Strait of Hormuz after their Army AH-64 Apache helicopter crashed during patrol operations. And in that rescue operation, the commander said that the maritime drone picked the 2 pilots up, transported them to another location on the water where they were hoisted up by helicopter for further transport. It is a 24-foot autonomous surface vessel that is designed for really long and rugged and long-duration missions and operates at speeds greater than 35 knots, carries at least up to 1,000 pounds, over 1,000 nautical miles, and is equipped with sensors that provide 360-degree passive sensing capabilities, and if nothing else, really significant. For those of you that remember the film Top Gun Maverick, there's a point where the Rear Admiral tells the Top Gun individual that indeed these planes that you're testing, sooner or later, we're going to simply use drones. We won't even need pilots who have to eat, sleep, all sorts of other things, complain, and disobey orders. And so, if nothing else, Maverick, your kind is headed for extinction. Well, maybe not today, but we are seeing that now a drone vessel was able to rescue 2 individuals out of the Strait of Hormuz. And welcome to the world of artificial intelligence, drones, robots, and much, much more. A couple more points to make about some things that are relatively unusual in our war in Iran. We'll talk about that right after this.
This is Viewpoints with Kerby Anderson.
Why do empires fall and civilizations die? Historian Arnold Toynbee concluded that they die from suicide rather than murder. Gatsad agrees with that assessment in his new book, Suicidal Empathy, Dying to be Kind. Having empathy is a virtue, but unchecked it can be a vice. He argues that empathy can lead you astray, especially when it becomes the only filter for making decisions and evaluating the wisdom of public policies. In a recent PragerU video, he provides a few examples. German Chancellor Angela Merkel began an open-door immigration policy. Her focus was on Muslim migrants who unfortunately had no intention of assimilating into their host society. In this country, we have the defund the police movement, motivated by the false belief that America has a racist police system. Mayors in major cities cut their police budgets, and the citizens suffered through increased crime. Under the Biden administration, the FAA implemented a recruitment program for people with severe intellectual and psychiatric disabilities, He wonders how safe you would feel when that woke logic reaches the cockpit. His conclusion is stark. No society can long survive such an explosion of suicidal empathy. Is there a cure? He provides 3 solutions. First, never shut off your rational mind. Suicidal empathy tries to override your capacity for reason. Second, always ask what happens next. Third, don't be tolerant of all viewpoints. Some ideas are better than others. Some cultures are better than others. We should be concerned about other people and show empathy, but we can't allow suicidal empathy to destroy our country and Western civilization. I'm Kerby Anderson, and that's my point of view.
Go deeper on topics like you just heard by visiting pointofview.net. That's pointofview.net. You're listening to Point of View, your listener-supported source for truth.
Back once again, just wanted to spend a little bit more time on this first article, which you can read in its entirety. 5 extraordinary developments in the Iran war. The first, of course, talking about the 30 missiles. I'm ahead of myself here. The 30 ballistic missiles that were launched, as well as the drone attack. And then, of course, rescuing those individuals from that particular drone surfacing. And if nothing else, it brings us back to, of course, that famous scene where in Top Gun you have the admiral, the rear admiral, challenging, of course, Maverick about the fact that pilots disobey orders, they eat, they sleep, they are not always available, and the end is inevitable, Maverick. Your kind is headed for extinction. Of course, Maverick then says, well, maybe so, sir, but not today. We love that because we love the pilots. We respect those in the military. But let's be honest, what we are seeing first in Ukraine, and now we're starting to see it in the Strait of Hormuz in the Iran war, is the fact that we have unmanned aircraft, we have unmanned seacraft, we have ground drones as well as air drones, and we are reaching the point right now where they can do everything human beings can do without a risk to life and limb, without the possibility of flag-draped caskets. And that's something we're going to have to think our way through. It's something we are planning to spend more time talking about here on Point of View. And in case you wonder, the latest Outlook magazine is on the whole issue of artificial intelligence. And one more reason to consider whether or not you would want to support Point of View on a regular basis. Monthly supporters receive the Outlook magazine. Those of you that support at the Truth Team level also receive booklets and all sorts of other benefits. But anyway, we have 5. We've talked about 3. Well, number 4, interestingly enough, Jim Garrity says, was that on Tuesday morning, President Trump told at least one reporter at the Wall Street Journal that the Iranian downing of the Apache helicopter wasn't a big deal. Now, he wasn't convinced at the time that there was a need to retaliate, but he changed his mind. That's due to the Defense Secretary Pete Hegseth, the Chairman of Joint Chiefs Staff Dan Kane, Raising Kane, recommended military action. Of course, indeed, that was what takes place. As we've said on this program so many times before, don't listen to necessarily what people say, listen to what they do. Maybe the president wasn't necessarily convinced that a retaliation was necessary, but of course, that's exactly what we did. And I think it illustrates again that was significant and an illustration demonstration again, those drones can do damage, and there's still drones available to the Iranian military. But then number 5, the U.S. Central Command made a statement Tuesday night about the night strikes, declared that CENTCOM forces struck Iranian air defense, ground control stations, and surveillance radar sites near the Strait of Hormuz with precision munitions from U.S. Air Force and Navy fighter jets. The operation was proportional response to the recent attacks on U.S. forces and internal commercial ships transiting the regional waters. That's the official statement from U.S. CENTCOM. And if nothing else, what you also have is the implication, if you read under the headlines, that yes, this was in retaliation and that you would then be attacking air defense ground control stations, which again illustrates that there is still more to do if indeed you want to actually bring the military in Iran to the level that the president has been reporting that it's destroyed. It is, I think, fairly honestly said, degraded. And if you watch some of the people in the mainstream press, they would almost make you think that Iran won the Iranian war. If you listen to some that are just uncritical supporters of the president, you would think that there was nothing left. But don't take press releases on either side. Look at the facts on the ground. And we've had a ceasefire that technically actually began, was it back in April, I think, is when that actually began. See if I can look up that in just a minute. But nevertheless, it's been about 7 weeks, according to this article. And there are certainly been attempts to deal with that. But at the same time, according to CNN, if you accept this report, Iran has now unblocked about 50 of the 69 tunnel entrances that were struck by the United States and Israel. And so in some cases, these underground missile facilities may be working once again, which is, of course, if you heard the conversation we had yesterday with Gary Fraser in the second hour, made the case that we need to keep going. I'm not necessarily convinced that the American people are ready for any more military action other than these isolated hits. But even as yesterday, Gary Fraser was talking about the two individuals engaged in negotiations. That was Steve Witkoff and Jared Kushner. If nothing else, a constant attempt to try to develop negotiations with the Iranian officials through Steve Witkoff and Jared Kushner are obviously specialists in real estate in Manhattan, but this is not a real estate deal. And in some respects, this is why some people have said, look, it is difficult to see a path to clear and lasting victory in this war, according to Jim Garrity, with a president this erratic and negotiators this naive. So again, I think it is unfair on the part of the legacy press to say that Iran has the upper hand, but it also is, I think, very naive to think that we have completely destroyed the Iranian military, as evidenced by the number of missiles and drones that have still been launched. That is at least as fair an assessment as I can give to you. And if you find yourself say, well, I want to read some more of the details, this is about 6 pages long. It is our first article, and I've entitled it Developments in the Iran War. If nothing else, remind you once again, use a fair amount of discernment, no matter who you listen to, no matter what you watch, no matter what you read. This one, I think, calls together material from a number of different sources, from CENTCOM to Wall Street Journal to, of course, some of the estimates that come even from the Congressional Research Arm and a variety of others. So there it is for you to read and try to get some assessment of what is taking place. Just before I take a break, let me real quickly get into the first of our 2 articles, and this one comes from the editorial board of the Wall Street Journal. Is California's election rigged? He said, the editors put it this way: President Trump's charge that Democrats rigged California's jungle primary has naturally elicited eye rolls given his habit of crying fraud whenever he loses an election. By the way, Democrats have been doing that for decades, but nevertheless. But he has a point that the state's Democrats have designed a leaky election system to juice their votes. One of the things that people point to is the fact that it appeared that Spencer Pratt, the TV celebrity who was running against Mayor Karen Bass, was going to come in second place with an 8-point lead over the next individual, and yet nevertheless she eventually now has been declared the winner, and that has caused a lot of people to say, it is a little bit odd, because when you look at the ballots that came in during the election, about 56%, about 47%, excuse me, I'm ahead of myself, 47% on election day were Democrat, but when the mail-in ballots came in, it was like 56%, and it's possible that mail-in ballots are heavily weighted towards Democrats, but you can see why there are some people that have had some real questions about that, because for those of you that don't live in the state of California, which is most of our listeners, California sends mail-in ballots to all registered voters who have until Election Day the opportunity to send them back. An ID is not required to register to vote, and there are all sorts of individuals that have been allowed to vote, including some that have 4 paws. One example that they point out here from the Wall Street Journal is a woman in Orange County, California, was charged last week with illegally registering her dog to vote and submitted ballots on her canine's behalf. Is there some election fraud? Of course there is. How much? Well, there is where the real question remains, which is why after the break we will spend some time digging into this, because if there's anybody that understands election fraud, it is the man that has written kind of the definitive book on that, John Fund, and he has a piece now in The Spectator, The Urgent Case for Fixing California's Broken Elections. He's originally from California. He has lots of connections there. And when we come back, for our California listeners, but for people in other maybe blue states, can we fix it? What can we do? And we'll talk about that right after these important messages.
Many years ago, they began saying that we live in the information age. Well, today there is so much information coming at us from every direction. The hardest thing is to discern which issues are really important and how can I make a positive impact without wasting my time trying to figure out accurate information. Let me give you a suggestion to help with that. Visit pointofview.net. Look at the tabs across the top. Find the one named Viewpoints. Kerby Anderson and others on our team are constantly watching for news to identify those issues that you really need to know about. They boil things down in a brief summary, and then you can decide if it's something on which you want to learn more and get involved. Again, when you go to pointofview.net, click on Viewpoints, you'll see exactly what I mean. You'll see the issues that we are covering right now. And when you like what you see, I honestly think you will, you can slide on over, enter your email, and get them automatically sent to your inbox each day. That's it. Take a minute now, be informed. Pointofview.net, click on Viewpoints. Point of View will continue after this. You are listening to Point of View. The opinions expressed on Point of View do not necessarily reflect the views of the management or staff of this station. And now, here again, is Kerby Anderson.
Back once again, this week can maybe talk about what, again, John Fund calls the urgent case for fixing California's broken elections. Now, again, I know many of you don't live in the state of California, but you may live in a state where some of the same concerns are surfacing. We have a Supreme Court case coming down that I think is going to change some of the rules, even in California, as well as in Maryland and Illinois, New York, and a variety of other places as well. But why particularly this article because it's written by John Fun. John Fun and Hans von Spakovsky are two individuals with great credentials who have over the years looked at voter fraud. Hans von Spakovsky now is actually with the Heritage Foundation, put together a database. Years ago, he had more than 1,000 examples of voter fraud. He said these aren't even representative. They're just the stories that we've posted that come from news reports. And of course, as I've pointed out so many times before, many district attorneys don't even prosecute or even look into voter fraud. One, because, well, it helped them, so why would they want to investigate it? But more importantly, it is a tedious and difficult process. And if you don't have the resources and funds and personnel, when you have other more pressing crimes, a lot of those are not prosecuted. And in places where money or resources have been provided, those numbers have increased dramatically. State of Texas is one very good example. So can we deal with this issue? First of all, let's recognize that the point-counterpoint is really not very helpful. You have, as John Fun points out, the president saying that they're cheating on the election, which led to, of course, almost immediately the California Attorney General Rob Bonta saying that this is just a figment of the imagination of Donald Trump and others involved in the conspiracy theory. But if nothing else, there are some really significant concerns. Nate Silver is an election analyst for ABC News, and if anything, probably would identify as a left-of-center kind of individual, but nevertheless said this the other day, it's hard to overstate how much of an outlier California is for its slow vote counting relative to literally any other state or almost any other industrialized democracy. This particular article has a picture, of course, of Steve Hilton, a Republican gubernatorial candidate. And so here, again, there is maybe a need to bring this state and other states in line. You know what happens when you try to have more voter integrity laws. I'm thinking of those of you in Georgia right now that remember what happened when the Georgia legislature said, let's have a few more common sense requirements so that the vote is tallied quickly and so the voter ID would be required. You remember everyone saying that this is Jim Crow 2.0, the decision to pull the All-Star game for baseball out of Atlanta and send it to Denver, and on and on and on. So every time you try to have more significant rules, you're going to have people on the other side criticize you. So will there be change in California? Well, I think a lot of people are skeptical. But nevertheless, there is a couple of hopeful signs. One in the state of California is that there will be a statewide citizen initiative to require ID to vote, both in person and mail-in balloting. Those of you in many other states say, are you kidding me? I mean, you have to not have an ID to vote. You have to use an ID, as you've heard us say on this program so many times, to board an airplane, buy alcohol, sometimes even buy certain pharmaceuticals, on and on and on. And again, that particular situation might change that. But nevertheless, as John Fun points out, since he's from California, has a lot of roots there, he says California's roots are a textbook example of how not to construct an election that inspires confidence. The state mails ballots to every registered votee, 23.2 million of them, but California does not adequately maintain its voter rolls. There are 873,000 people that we know of on the rolls, that comes from Judicial Watch, who are either felons, have moved, died, or don't have a real address in terms of getting the ballots. But several voters, he actually says he's talked to, say they still receive multiple ballots for themselves or ballots for people who have died and moved. This is not the way to run an election. I think we all understand that. Then, of course, the ballots are to be received even up to 7 days after the election, if indeed they're postmarked. But, of course, the reality is that the U.S. Postal Service doesn't postmark first-class mail. But if the ballot is received without a postmark after the election, it's counted if the voter has at least handwritten the date on the envelope. If the voter claims that he can't physically sign the ballot, state regulations allow them to make a mark and have it attested to by a witness, but the witness signature isn't checked, and you can see the potential for all sorts of abuse right there. But again, don't think it's just an individual that might be more inclined to support Republicans and Democrats. One of the quotes in here from John Fund is of Mark Penn. Who is he? Well, he was the chief pollster for President Bill Clinton, and even he, having been a Democrat, a lifelong Democrat, having worked in the Clinton administration, says that, again, California is allowing people to game the system, especially through the issue of ballot harvesting. It says it is banned in most states and should be banned everywhere because it promotes people sitting around tables pressured to vote certain ways as their ballots are collected by partisans. And again, when you have loose registration rules, you can see the problems. And one of the things John Fund does is he actually takes you to the guidelines that are actually provided. These guidelines, which I'm going to quote from, come from the Democratic Socialist of America, the chapter in Los Angeles, but it's suggested that when you actually want to go about ballot harvesting, you say, here's the direct quote, if we fill the mail ballot out together right now, then there's an official place to sign it over to me and bring it to the city directly either today or the first thing tomorrow morning. If you don't think that is intimidating or leads to individuals actually voting according to the way the ballot harvester would like you to vote, then I do have some swampland I'd like to sell you. And, of course, for first-time voters, they have to have some kind of ID, but it doesn't have to be anything significant. It could be a gym membership card. You know, if you're a member of Gold's Gym, you know, they're not checking to see whether you're a citizen of the United States. An employer ID card, a credit card, a prescription drug label, an insurance card. Of course, California hands those out to everybody, including illegal aliens or anything else. And so, again, last month, a woman pleaded guilty to federal charges for paying homeless people on Skid Row in Los Angeles to register using her former address, meaning that the ballots would be sent there. And so you can see there's just a lot of concern about a system that basically puts flexibility first and certainty and reliability last. But again, will there be any changes? Well, according to the Wall Street Journal editorial page, they said that the state's loose voting rules and dilatory counting fuel distrust in elections. But we are skeptical in California with basically one-party Democratic machine. As long as progressives are winning, maybe not. I've oftentimes said that the best way was maybe to fight fire with fire. You might remember that Turning Point USA said, well, if you're going to ballot harvest, we'll ballot harvest. And all of a sudden, turning over an election or two with ballot harvesting and electing a Republican might get people's attention. But help may be on the way. I mentioned one particular issue, and that is this initiative that is something that will be voted on in November, but this month we are concluding that the Supreme Court is going to announce a decision. I will predict that it will rule that states like California and other states must treat Election Day as an endpoint for voting and eliminate some of the problems of ballots showing up days, and in this case, 7 days, almost a week later. But if you'd like to maybe think of what can be done if you're in the state of California to fix California's broken electoral system, or if you're in a state that needs more help, let me commend you the third article we've posted here, and that's by our good friend John Fund. He's somebody I quote in our booklet on voter fraud, recognizing that there are some that will at least now acknowledge that there's probably some voter fraud, which causes me to then ask the question, well, how much voter fraud do you think is acceptable? Or they'll sometimes assure us that, yes, there's some voter fraud, but it didn't affect the outcome. Well, how do you know if you don't even investigate it and prosecute it? And you can kind of see that many of those arguments being made against voter integrity fail almost immediately. But it's our third article. I thought it would be helpful in light of the fact that we're still waiting for some of the final tally to come in. We'll be back right after this.
You're listening to Point of View, your listener-supported source for truth.
Back for a few more minutes. Let me mention that next hour we're going to spend some time, first of all, talking with Christopher Reese. And again, he is the editor of the Worldview Bulletin. We have a piece here on the resurrection and the fear of death. Very good piece. And then we're going to spend some time talking with Dr. Hormoz Shariat. And, of course, he is head of Iran Alive Ministries, which is something, of course, we'll be talking about in terms of what has happened in Iran. But in particular, I also want to talk about this new film, The Great American Conflict, The Clash of the Cultures, which really just gets us into some of the things happening in the Muslim world, not only in the Middle East, but right here in the United States. Of course, one of the more recent booklets I've put out is on Sharia law, so we'll get into some of that, but also some of the hope of very significant number of Muslims who've become Christians. So we'll be talking about that with him, and of course pointing you to the film that you would perhaps like to watch as well. Real quickly, though, before we wind down, Victor Davis Hanson has a piece which, of course, has the rather arresting title, Stop Destroying Civilization. And I'm just going to pick 3 points that he makes. But the first one is, you might remember, if you've got a long memory, that we used to have what was called the hashtag Me Too movement, Believe All Women, and how that was used at the time against the Supreme Court nominee Brett Kavanaugh because of some of the claims made by Christine Blasey Ford, which at the time made no sense, were preposterous, and they were really easily refuted. But we had this idea of believe all women, and then that changed rather dramatically, because he points out, and this is one of the things I appreciate about Victor Davis Hanson, he puts some of this in historical context. Because then, of course, when you had, again, Joe Biden running, there was very good, credible evidence from Tara Reade about how he had sexually assaulted her when she was a senatorial staffer. And it wasn't just her, it was 7 other women that alleged that he had acted with sexually inappropriate ways. And yet that got jettisoned almost immediately because, after all, we won't pay attention to that. We now then, of course, found out about all sorts of other sexual misconduct. And he mentions the former governor of New York, Andrew Cuomo, the former member of Congress, Eric Swalwell, who had to disband his governorship gubernatorial campaign, I guess I should say, bringing this, of course, to one that we've talked about around this table more than once, Graham Plattner, who now has won the primary and will indeed be running for the U.S. Senate in Maine, with just all sorts of statements of course, not just his Nazi fascination, but his contempt for women, his violence, and on and on and on. And of all people, then you have Senator Elizabeth Warren coming to the campaign rally in Portland, Maine, saying, I'm here because Washington needs fighters, and Graham Plattner is a fighter we need. What happened to all of the, if you will, Me Too? And so he moves from there to the Me Too movement to the Black Lives Matter. You might remember that rose in large part due to the death of Michael Brown in Ferguson, Missouri, because of the alleged statement, hands up, don't shoot, which we know was false because he attacked the police officer repeatedly, was lethally shot as he charged towards the officer. You then, of course, had all sorts of evidence. He talks about, of course, Jesse Smollett saying that he was attacked by white mega thugs in the wee hours in cold California, Chicago, I should say. Of course, that was not the case. On and on, just the number number of things that happened that helped bring money into the coffers of BLM, not the least of which is no one really ever taking the time to explain where all that money went, not to mention, of course, all the riots that took place as well. He lists 35 deaths, 1,500 injured law enforcement officers, $2 billion in property damage, 14,000 arrests, the torching of police precinct, but more and more, just the whole impact that it had on the citizens, which we've talked about before. As a matter of fact, my piece today, which gets into this whole idea of suicidal empathy, when the argument was we have a racist police system, we'll defund the police, and the people that suffered the most were the citizens who did not have individuals in law enforcement to protect them. He goes on to remind us of what happened in England. You've been following perhaps the story of Henry Nowak, which has now led to some of these riots there in Ireland. But I'll move on to the third one because the third one also is relevant. Well, we're talking about everything from Me Too as well as BLM and racism. You have, of course, the whole issue of global warming. And this has, as he points out, led not only to the fact that we, in many cases, have decided not to do some things that would provide enough energy now for some of the data centers that supposedly we need, but he points out that Germany essentially has wrecked its economy to seek what he called this mythical net zero carbon emissions by dismantling natural gas, oil, and nuclear power plants, turning to costly and much less efficient and less reliable solar and wind power. And he says much of this has just kind of led to this kind of left-wing postmodern globalist notion of a borderless utopian world that will fuel endless diversity, which has done a tremendous amount of damage in the world, showing up in all sorts of ways. Of course, everything from DEI to what he calls the transgender frenzy. And as a result, what we are seeing is more and more examples of not really being able to think clearly about these issues. And so he ends by saying, well, what accounts for all of this periodic, collective, and suicidal madness, which matches up very much with my piece today on suicidal empathy? He says, first of all, much of this craziness is almost always birthed in the contemporary, affluent, and leisured West, which alone has the capital and the resources to afford what he calls these freakish sideshows. Then the frenzies are usually the creation of the left, but most of those are birthed in our universities, our liberal universities, our liberal media, and our bureaucracies. And so very quickly on, then you're told to get rid of your natural gas dryer and grill. You're supposed to hire thousands of race and gender commissars to figure out whether or not you've done enough to match DEI. And you have a series of attempts to, in one way or another, remake the culture in which you find yourself. And ultimately, you find an elite that embraces racial fixations, globalism, laxity on crime, and kind of a degrowth environmentalism. So he begins to point out that if this continues, you're going to have more and more push by the newly elected individuals in November and maybe even 2 years after that, if that makes its way to the White House, in, again, a return to open borders, an attempt to try to change many of those time-tested rules, whether it's to demolish the Electoral College, to pack the Supreme Court, and in some respects recognize that all of this leads to very significant attempts, if not intended. The unintended consequence is to destroy America and Western civilization. Incredible piece by Victor Davis Hanson, goes on for pages. I would encourage you, again, about 6 pages to read it, because if nothing else, it's a reminder that these ideas have consequences, and bad ideas have victims. We certainly need to do what we can to promote human flourishing. We'll take a break, talk about that right after this.
Will the American experiment endure? As we approach the 250th anniversary for our nation, we must recognize the answer to that question largely depends on us. In 1789, President George Washington said something important. He said, "America is an experiment entrusted to the hands of the American people." That means that our actions, our values, determine the course of our nation. Washington also argued that we can't expect blessings if we ignore God's moral order. If you want to help the American experiment endure, if you want to restore the moral foundation that made this nation strong, partner with Point of View. Your support equips listeners to live according to God's moral order and defend freedom for the future. Give this month and your gift will be doubled. Call or click today at pointofview.net or call 1-800-347-5151. That's pointofview.net and 1-800-347-5151. Point of View will continue after this. Across America, live, this is Point of View. And now, Kerby Anderson.
Second hour today, we're going to spend some time talking with a couple of different guests. Christopher Reese is, of course, a friend that we've had on the program many times before, founder and editor-in-chief of the Worldview Bulletin. We're going to talk about his article, Resurrection and the Fear of Death. And then at the bottom of the hour, we're going to go to Dr. Hormoz Shariat. Of course, is an individual that we've also interviewed on this program before, talking about the ministry that he has as an individual with Iran Alive ministry. So we'll talk about Iran for a few minutes, but a lot of it has to do with this new documentary, which you can watch on YouTube, The Great American Conflict. So a lot to cover this hour. And again, if you find yourself wanting to know more, you will find these links on our website, pointofview.net, a newly revised website. So if you haven't gone there, you might check it out and click on some buttons and look around. I think it has been a significant improvement. But as you might imagine, when you change everything over, if you find some things that need to be fixed or it's a little confusing, we'd love to hear from you on that regard as well. Christopher Reese is, again, a blogger and an expert in Christian worldview issues, author of a number of things, including 100 Old Testament quotes by Jesus, how Jesus used the Hebrew Scriptures, founder and editor of the Worldview Bulletin, and an individual that we call on from time to time. So, Christopher, welcome back to Point of View.
Thanks so much, Kerby. Appreciate you having me on again, and always great to be here to talk with you about these important topics.
Let's, if we can, talk about the Worldview Bulletin for just a minute. I've been promoting it many times, but let's talk about the fact that just over the last couple of months, I've had a chance to interview 3 different authors on the issue of apologetics. And one of those authors is Dr. Jeremiah Johnston. And I saw that if you go to the Worldview Bulletin, that is one of the features that you have right now. And so it's a great way, is it not, to keep up with some things. I think we're kind of in this golden age of worldview and apologetics, maybe the golden age of archaeology. 3 different books that have come out over the last couple of months. The most recent one, an interview I did with Dr. Paul Weaver. Maybe you should get him on there as well. But Jeremiah Johnston, and it does seem to me that if you want to keep up to date with what's happening in the area of worldview, what's happening in the area of apologetics, getting a subscription to your bulletin is a good way to do so, don't you think?
Yeah, I appreciate that. We publish at least once a week, and we try to cover a wide range of topics related to apologetics and the Christian worldview, and try to keep it encouraging and interesting and informative. And so, I would encourage anyone who's interested in those topics to, look for Worldview Bulletin, Google it, and you can sign up, and would love to have you join us.
Again, if you click on your picture there, we have a link to the website, a link to Facebook, and a link to X. So the way we have it now, that will just immediately take you there to substack.com/ and then Worldview Bulletin. So there you can see some of that. And, of course, matter of fact, the first thing that pops up is the Jesus Discovery book and what is hidden in the ancient burial box. So you can subscribe right there. You can look it through a little bit, get a little bit of a feel. And so we've got that link on the website, pointofview.net. Okay, resurrection. Well, this would be an obvious one for Easter, but what I think is so interesting, Christopher, is you start by talking about the importance of the resurrection, and then you jump to some of these atheists or naturalists who certainly say there is no purpose to the universe, there is no meaning to life, and to ask the question, why am I here, is really fallacious. So either the resurrection is true and there's meaning to life, or the resurrection is false and the atheist and the so-called new atheist are right. And in some respects, that's kind of why you wrote this piece, isn't it?
Yeah, that's true. The main idea behind it was, like you said, contrasting the two viewpoints. With Christianity, we have hope because Christ rose from the dead and conquered death, and he's reconciled us to God. And that's a very hopeful view. It means that we'll have eternal life in a beautiful place and, be experiencing bliss there, with God in eternity. And that contrasts very much with the naturalistic perspective, in which basically life ends at the grave and there's nothing beyond it. And so, in many ways, life is devoid of meaning and value and purpose because there is no afterlife, and essentially we're just kind of molecules in motion, kind of accidents here, and so that's a very bleak perspective.
One of the things you say early on is, unlike most other religions whose teachings consist of moral and physical principles, Christianity depends crucially on the historical death and resurrection of the founder. I was listening to an atheist talk the other day, and he was saying, I've read some of these religions, and, he was sort of implying that they're all basically the same. They don't really answer the real questions. And I thought, nope, you can't play that game because you're treating religion sort of like flavors of ice cream. Well, you like chocolate, and I like butter pecan, and you like cherry Garcia, and you like some, everybody's got their favorite. And no, because historicity is very key. If indeed the Bible is false, then, and it's historically false, and if the resurrection is false, then Christianity, even according to the Apostle Paul in 1 Corinthians 15, is a wasted endeavor because your faith is in vain. And so in some respects, people want to treat Christianity like any other religion. Yes, it has a religious element, but I think the truth claims of Christianity go all the way back to the resurrection, and you can't really treat it like flavors of ice cream or my favorite color, because either it's true or it's not true. And if it's not true, it's not worth your time. But if it is true, it by definition invalidates all the other religious faiths. Don't you think?
That's true. I quote one scholar in the piece who made the point that with a lot of the Eastern religions, it's not even necessary that you can trace it back to a particular founder because it's mainly sort of principles for how to live, moral living, that type of thing. And you can have those philosophies, even without a particular person who founded it. But with Christianity, it's definitely different. Jesus primarily proclaimed himself rather than any type of sort of belief system or philosophy. He said, I am the way and the truth and the life, and constantly told people, they needed to believe in him personally. And so, Jesus is definitely unique in that sense. And like you said, without the resurrection, Paul says that our faith would be in vain apart from that.
Right. Yeah. Again, it rises or falls on who Jesus is. When we come back, I want to do a little bit of apologetics, because when was 1 Corinthians 15 written? And then we'll contrast that with all these atheistic, naturalistic philosophers. We'll continue our conversation with Christopher Reese on resurrection and the fear of death right after this.
This is Viewpoints with Kerby Anderson.
Why do empires fall and civilizations die? Historian Arnold Toynbee concluded that they die from suicide rather than murder. Gatsad agrees with that assessment in his new book, Suicidal Empathy, Dying to be Kind. Having empathy is a virtue, but unchecked it can be a vice. He argues that empathy can lead you astray, especially when it becomes the only filter for making decisions and evaluating the wisdom of public policies. In a recent PragerU video, he provides a few examples. German Chancellor Angela Merkel began an open-door immigration policy. Her focus was on Muslim migrants who unfortunately had no intention of assimilating into their host society. In this country, we have the defund the police movement, motivated by the false belief that America has a racist police system. Mayors in major cities cut their police budgets, and the citizens suffered through increased crime. Under the Biden administration, the FAA implemented a recruitment program for people with severe intellectual and psychiatric disabilities. He wonders how safe you would feel when that woke logic reaches the cockpit. His conclusion is stark. No society can long survive such an explosion of suicidal empathy. Is there a cure? He provides 3 solutions. First, never shut off your rational mind. Suicidal empathy tries to override your capacity for reason. Second, always ask what happens next. Third, don't be tolerant of all viewpoints. Some ideas are better than others. Some cultures are better than others. We should be concerned about other people and show empathy, but we can't allow suicidal empathy to destroy our country and Western civilization. I'm Kerby Anderson, and that's my point of view.
Go deeper on topics like you just heard by visiting pointofview.net. That's pointofview.net. You're listening to Point of View, your listener-supported source for truth.
Back for a few more minutes with Christopher Reese as we talk about resurrection and the fear of death. And Christopher, for just a minute, let's go to 1 Corinthians 15, because that's really where the Apostle Paul makes the case for Christianity. But you point out something that we've talked about before with people like Lee Strobel, and that is if you read the first few verses of 1 Corinthians 15, essentially verses 3 through 7, what Paul is doing is quoting a creed, a pre-existing creed. And I think sometimes people miss all this because we'll have people say, well, when was the Bible written? When was the New Testament written? And in the case of 1 Corinthians in the 50s, so a little less than 20 years after Jesus died. But the creed was before that, and what Paul is doing is quoting a creed that existed at the time, and in a sense, possibly something that was said in the early church as a tradition, as you point out, from one individual saying maybe within months of the death of Jesus. So when you talk about the gap between when Jesus died and even some of the first Gospels or the first, if you will, epistles, you have to go back even earlier to the time just right after Christ died, because what you are reading in 1 Corinthians 15, verses 3 through 7, is a creed that existed almost immediately after the death and resurrection of Jesus.
That's true. And one interesting thing, as you mentioned, Paul is writing 1 Corinthians about 20 years after Jesus died. And sometimes skeptics will say, the Gospels were written decades after the events. And, how can we trust that? But that really betrays kind of an ignorance of ancient history. Just give an example, the best-known biography of Alexander the Great by Arian was written 400 years
yes.
after Alexander died. One of the important biographies of Aristotle was written 500 years after he died. And so for ancient history, centuries is often the norm for these sources that, historians put a great degree of trust in. And so decades is nothing, compared to that.
Right. And it's even less than decades when you start getting into something like the Creed. And I think it's just an illustration that, I've said this before, you can go into a classroom on history and professors will quote from Roman history, Tacitus, Suetonius, Caesar's Gallic Wars, written by the old boaster himself, and say that these are historically accurate when the gap between the copy we have and the original is huge. And then, of course, you come to the New Testament, and they'll make fun of New Testament scholarship or whether or not we even know that Jesus existed. And they just can't be consistent, because either you accept the historical reliability of the New Testament or you have to throw out all of ancient history. And I think it's a good point that you made just in passing, but let's, if we can, go to our atheistic friends. You quote from one, a naturalist philosopher, that is, he believes in nature. What is the purpose of the universe? There is none. What is the meaning of life? Ditto. Why am I here? Just dumb luck. Is there a soul? Is it immortal? Are you kidding? What happens when we die? Well, we just die. Well, that's not exactly something that's going to give you any kind of encouragement, is it?
That's true. One thing I do appreciate about that quote by Alex Rosenberg, a naturalist philosopher, I appreciate that at least he's honest about it.
Yes.
A lot of skeptics today, if you try to point this out, this lack of meaning on naturalism, you get a lot of pushback on that. And, they'll say, that's not true. We don't need God for meaning. But there's a large collection of atheists who will just bite the bullet and just admit it. So I always admire that honesty. Don't try to sugarcoat it. Just kind of say it like it is.
Well, and let's see if we can. You got Sam Harris here said, well, I do have existential worries about death, and I'm concerned about it. But let me quote from a few of his other fellow so-called new atheists. Daniel Dennett said, in the beginning, there were no reasons. There were only causes. Nothing had a purpose. Nothing has so much as a function. There was no teleology in the world at all. That's pretty difficult. How about Richard Dawkins? In the universe of blind physical forces and genetic replication, some people are going to get hurt and other people are going to get lucky. And you won't find any rhyme nor reason to it, nor any justice. The universe, we observe, has precisely the properties we would expect if, at the bottom, there's no design, no purpose, no evil, and no good. Nothing but blind, pitiless indifference. DNA neither knows nor cares. DNA just is, and we dance to its music. If somebody's really depressed right now and they hear just a few of these quotes, they might be tempted to end it all. But the good news is, what we're trying to say is that there is this deep longing for meaning, and yet the atheists who tell us, well, I can find meaning in my work or meaning in staying alive, maybe meaning in trying to reach the singularity, the only place you're going to find real meaning is in the gospel, in Christianity, in the truthfulness of the resurrection. Because if that's not true, as the Apostle Paul says, then we're all to be pitied, because it's just a vain belief, but it is not without any kind of justification. But the good news is we can find purpose if we actually depend upon God. And in some respects, we can, as Peter even talks about, see that there's a living hope through the resurrection of Jesus Christ from the dead.
That's true. You can, as an atheist or a naturalist, you can create subjective meanings for your life. Maybe you want to be, the best baseball player you can be, or the best plumber or teacher, but those are subjective meanings, not objective meanings, and that's kind of the key point here is apart from God existing, there's no objective meaning, because on naturalism we're just sort of accidental byproducts of the universe. Where no one put us here. There's no reason for any of it. And, we just have to kind of try to manufacture our own meanings, sort of out of thin air. And so that's what's completely missing on naturalism, that Christianity gives us an objective meaning because God put us here for a reason and wants to have a relationship with us.
Well, let me just mention, just before I run out of time, that we do have next to your picture, Christopher Reese, THM. We have one which is for your website, one for Facebook, one for X. If you go and just click on the one for the website, it will take you to the Substack where you can see the Worldview Bulletin newsletter. Ever since Paul Copan and others that actually pulled this together, I've always said that it is a great source for news, information, worldview content. It has been a great source for my producer, Steve Miller, to find other people, because I've known Doug Groteis for generations and some of the other individuals, but it seems to me that there are other people that are sort of rising stars or people writing about worldview and apologetics, and if you want to kind of be on the cutting edge and learn more about that, you can certainly go to the website, pointofview.net, or simply go to the Worldview Bulletin. So if nothing else, thank you for writing this article. Thank you for diligently being the editor-in-chief all these years, and thank you for joining us today here on Point of View.
Thanks so much for having me, Kirby. God bless you.
Let me just mention again, if you go to that link, the one that we provided right at the moment, where you can just see one of those, is just about the ossuary. It is actually called the James ossuary, and it talks about James, the brother of Jesus. It's one of the 10 significant archaeological evidences that Dr. Jeremiah Johnston has in his book about the Jesus discoveries. And so you could actually see that particular one and read it even without necessarily reading the entire newsletter. And this is another way for you to find out about very good books and movies and resources that will help advance your faith. We're all about apologetics. We're all about worldview, and we have always appreciated the good work that they do there at the Worldview Bulletin, so check that out. We come back, though. Iran has been in the news. It's certainly going to be great to have Dr. Hormoz Shariat talk about what he is doing in terms of reaching out to those in Iran, but also a new movie, The Great American Conflict, The Clash of the Cultures. All that coming up right after this.
Have you ever met a child you knew would do great things? They displayed remarkable imagination, understanding, and a zest for learning. Now imagine someone takes that child and instead of fostering their potential with a real education, they feed them nothing but lies. You know, that scenario isn't so far from reality. From a young age, Americans are fed a consistent stream of distorted facts, from the secular indoctrination they receive in many public schools, to the biases presented as fact in many colleges and universities, to the barrage of misinformation from the mainstream media and the lack of moral grounding in our society. It's not that Americans aren't capable of understanding the truth, it's that they aren't exposed to it enough. You can expose more Americans to the truth when you give to Point of View, where listeners receive facts, perspective, and biblical truth they don't get from society. As long as we have truth, we have hope. Give today at pointofview.net or call 1-800-347-5151. Pointofview.net and 1-800-347-5151. Point of View will continue after this. You are listening to Point of View. The opinions expressed on Point of View do not necessarily reflect the views of the management or staff of this station. And now, here again, is Kerby Anderson.
You know, we started the program by talking about some of the developments in the Iran war. I wanted to end by talking about what is happening in Iran, especially to Christians that are there, and the outreach that exists through this wonderful ministry called Iran Alive. You can go to iranalive.org or follow the links. From compassion to Christ, when crisis strikes, compassion opens hearts to Christ. 120,000 documented salvations since 2001, which is when Dr. Hormoz Shariat, who was born into a Muslim family in Iran, founded Iran Alive Ministries, came to Christ while earning his PhD in, of all things, artificial intelligence, one of the topics we've addressed here so often here, when he was at USC, and he has developed this technology through Iran Alive Ministries, using satellite TV to reach millions of lost and broken people in Iran and throughout the Middle East, broadcast the gospel 24/7 from right here in Dallas to Iran and the Middle East. Dr. Shariat, welcome back to Point of View.
Well, thank you for having me, Kerby.
I might just mention we have not only a link to iranalive.org, which I want to talk about for a few minutes, but then to this film that people can watch on YouTube, The Great American Conflict, The Clash of the Cultures, which includes you and Brigitte Gabriel, who's been on the program, a variety of other individuals. But let's talk about your ministry for just a minute, because all of our eyes are focused oftentimes on what is happening in Iran, but you probably have a better perspective on what is happening than anyone else. What can you share?
Yes, I'm in touch with people in Iran. As you mentioned, we have been broadcasting satellite and social media the last few years. And I'm in touch with the believers in Iran, our leaders, underground churches. So what's happening in Iran is very painful for the people of Iran. The massacre of 40,000 people in January, yes, and then execution of those prisoners every day. I mean, because it's every day, it's not in the news anymore, because it's repetition. They're killing these young people, a few every day. Last year, it was an average of 6 people per day that they executed. So there is a lot of misery in Iran. The war has made it worse. People are hopeless because they were hoping that these aerial attacks by U.S. and by Netanyahu, by Israel, would bring down the government. It didn't. They're surviving. And then they're talking about negotiations. So the people of Iran are very desperate, very hopeless. We need to pray for them. At the same time, we see an openness in the hearts of Iranians.
Yes.
As you know, in our lives, the more suffering we go through, the more open we become to the Lord. And that's what's happening in Iran. A lot of suffering, but open heaven spiritually in Iran.
Let's talk about your ministry for just a minute. Broadcasting the gospel 24/7 across the Middle East, pastoring an online church of 1 million Iranians, and then also training Christian leaders in that country. Can you tell us a little bit more about that?
Yes, media is powerful. So God, you helped us and inspired us to use media over 25 years ago. But I want to encourage your audience. Hey, media is the language of today. You have to learn that. You have to use media to communicate the gospel. So we use media. Satellite television is signal goes over the heads of the mullahs into people's homes. And because the signal comes from the sky, the government, the mullahs cannot stop it. So here, what an amazing opportunity to go in the homes of millions of people. According to an independent survey, we have 7 million viewers every day. So going into 7 million people every day in their living room and talk to them eye to eye, heart to heart about the love of Christ, which they are seeking. They're sick and tired of the Allah, who is cruel and a distant God, and they're looking for a true God, which is love and forgiveness. So that's why we are getting such a great result. People are open to the gospel. And I want to share the power of media. That they have changed their mind about Christianity. Iranians used to be very negative about Christianity 25 years ago when we started. And they say, oh, they're infidels. I mean, not just infidels, they're adulterous people. They're always drunk and all that, but they have changed. And now with social media, you know what we can do? And we are doing with social media. With satellite television, you go into the living rooms. But with social media, with these mobile phones, you're going to their bedrooms, and may I say even to their bathrooms to talk to them about Jesus. Amazing time to use technology. And salvation is the start for us. It's not the end. People come to Christ, but Jesus said make disciples. So we are discipling, we are training leaders, and we are planting online churches and underground house churches.
Again, all of that is available if you go to iranalive.org. And since you were talking about the number of people that are coming, whether it's you or Joel Rosenberg or a variety of others, I think you're all saying the same thing, and that is greater number of Muslims coming to Christianity in these last few years than any time in the past. So a very significant time to strategically broadcast this message to individuals in Iran or all through the Middle East.
That's right. Openness in Iran is supernatural. God has opened their hearts. And of course, signs and wonders, visions and dreams also have had a part. Media had a part, but God, Jesus himself opening the hearts, and he's appearing to many, many Muslims. So this is a historical time to work in Iran. And I ask everybody, at least pray, because what happens in Iran is not going to impact just Iran, and not just the Middle East, but the whole world. I mean, if Iranian government has a nuclear bomb, with the recklessness that we saw, they attacked missiles, their neighbors, Kuwait and Dubai and every country. What if they had a nuclear bomb? They will have no problem using it. So this is not just an Iran issue, that's a world issue. We need to pray that this government will change and the people of Iran will be set free.
Let me just mention again, we have a link to your website, a link to Facebook, to X, as well as Instagram. So any way that you would like to connect up with Dr. Shariat, you can do so. But we also have a link to the Great American Conflict, the Clash of the Cultures. Now, this is more than just helping us understand what is happening in Iran. In some respects, Dr. Shariat is really helping us understand what's happening here in this country. The other day, I was invited to speak to a Rotary about the issue of Islam and Sharia law. And of course, you live in this area as well, so you're well aware of the fact that more and more people are concerned about some of the mindset and some of the worldview and ideas that some of the more radical Muslims are bringing into even this country. Can you explain?
That's right. That's another issue. We're working in Iran, but let me tell you the story. The last few years, we come from Muslim background. We are Christians living in Iran, those who serve here, and in headquarters in North McKinney. So we felt a burden for America. I said, they have this nation. It's so great. It has blessed many nations. I came to Christ here, and they helped me to reach out to my nation. And then we got sad. You know why? Because we saw Islam has a plan for America, has a plan for Texas, and most Americans, Christians and non-Christians, kind of like oblivious. They're half asleep. They're not seeing it. Because of that love for America and for love for Muslims. We love Muslims. So that's why we started. We said, we got to do something to help American churches and Christians, at least Christians, to see what true Islam is. The Islam that they introduced in the West is not true Islam. True Islam is what is practiced in Iran, in Afghanistan, and by ISIS. That's the true Islam. So, but they have such a strategy. You mentioned Texas. Did you know over 50 mosques were started in DFW the last 2 years? New. A few years ago, only 1 or 2 mosques were in whole Texas. Now it's almost 400 mosques are in Texas. They have targeted Texas because of the friendliness here. They find a way that they can practice it. Now, some people say, so what's wrong with this? You know, we worship in our churches. Let them worship in their mosque. But the problem is Islam is more a political concept, a political theology than spiritual. In those mosques, they have a plan, and they are implementing the plan to impact and to destroy the American culture. Even in DFW, they are pushing for, as you mentioned, for Sharia law. They say, we don't want to follow your law. We want to have a parallel court. We want to follow our laws. And you know what Sharia law allows? Child marriage. So none of your business. If we allow it, multiple marriages and husbands beating women, they come to us and we take care of that. So
let me just take a quick break because there's some more that you certainly want to cover. And we, if you're interested, have a link to Iran Alive Ministries, and you can find that on our website. We'll continue our conversation right after this.
You're listening to Point of View, your listener-supported source for truth.
Back once again, one of the questions that sometimes people ask is, well, if we have people wanting to promote Sharia law, how do we respond to that? And on our booklet that we make available, we wrote one years ago, but updated it because of all things happening right here in the United States and not far from where this broadcast is taking place in the state of Texas. I say, well, remember 3 numbers, 1, 8, and 14. 1 stands for the First Amendment, and that is that we should not have an establishment of religion, but Sharia law would establish Islam as the major religion, so there's a problem. 8 stands for the Eighth Amendment, which is a prohibition against cruel and unusual punishment, and I think you can understand if you know anything about Sharia law that would be a violation of the Eighth Amendment. And then 14 stands for the idea of equal protection, that each individual has equality before the law, but under Sharia law, Muslims have more rights than non-Muslims, men have more rights than women. So for a number of reasons, Dr. Hormoz Shariat, Sharia law is not compatible with constitutional law, which is why you see more and more state legislatures actually passing some kind of rules, regulations, or laws prohibiting the use of Sharia law, even in civil courts, much less as criminal courts. And this is something that you've been talking about for some time, haven't you?
Yes. Unfortunately, most people do not know the true Islam. The Islam in the West is a deceptive. And by the way, deception is a value in Islam. And Muhammad, the Prophet, did that, and Quran is encouraging that for the cause of Allah, you can deceive, and then the result is kill, steal, and destroy, which we know who does that. So we have to be aware. Our goal is to produce that documentary. Iran's Great Awakening is a documentary we just released. Mm-hmm. Our goal was to bring fear to the heart of people, but awareness, and not hatred towards the people, towards Muslims in the hearts of people, but love. Some people say, are you Islamophobic? I said, no, I'm not Islamophobic. I'm Islamophilic. I love them. It's you who are afraid of them, and it's you who are afraid to tell the truth. One of my friends, let me tell you this, one of my friends who was a Muslim came to Christ in America. He told me this. He said, Americans don't know what's going on in these mosques. I was there. I was a part of a mosque. And they don't even dare to ask. He said, in our mosque, they don't come, the U.S. government, they don't come and say, what are you teaching here? He said, did you know in our library, in the mosque that I used to go, there were books about subverting America, how to take over America. There were books there were classes there in my mosque. But U.S. Government does not dare to go and say, what are you preaching? What are you doing? What is in your library? He said, that's what's happening. Islam is political, has a plan, long-term plan for America. Is that a hype? Is that hypothesis? Am I just making a small thing big? No. Just look at Europe. Look at UK. UK, where it is, it's where US will be if we don't do anything. Where Muslims are taking over the cities in UK, they're implementing Sharia law, and it happens gradually. Let's be careful. Let's be watchful, not hate Muslims. Actually, I want to, when people who see this documentary, of course, become aware, but at the same time, be motivated to reach out to Muslims with love of Christ and share the gospel, because many of them are open. So watch this documentary, share it in your church, bring awareness to America, but not to cause hatred, but to cause love, and not to cause fear, but to cause love. Perfect love casts out fear.
Let's begin talk about what is available. First of all, we have a link to the trailer, and I know that busy people right now might just simply say, okay, let me just kind of see what it's going to be like. And you've got a couple of interviews there that give you a pretty good understanding of that. But then if somebody wanted to show the film to their family, to their church, or something like that, it does seem to me that there is a way in which they can connect up with you, and how can they do so?
Yes, you make a request. If you go to our landing page, we just added that option too. Not just watch the film. We added the option that I want to show this in our church or our group. And number 3 option, we have a few staff that are passionate about America and helping America. These are all Muslim background believers living in the U.S. We have great speakers that can come to your church to show the film, but teach and talk about and train about Muslim evangelism and evangelism in general. So you can watch the film, you can show it in a group, or you can even ask for a speaker from our team to come and share that in your church or group.
And let me just mention again that you can go to the website, go all the way to the bottom, and it has Iran Live, and then it has the email, it has the phone, it has some of the ways in which you can contact, and if you want to support the ministry, you can do so as well. But I think the first step is simply to go and watch that short video that is a trailer. And then I was remiss in pointing out the fact that while I was also talking about the website of Iran Live, we also have the website, your own personal one as well. And people don't have to know how to spell your name because we have that link there as well. So we have 2 different websites, Facebook, X, and Instagram, all sorts of great opportunities. And if you really are concerned about what is happening in Iran, and you should, I think you should pray for this ministry, pray for the believers in Iran, pray for a change. And again, there are just all sorts of issues front and center that have reminded us of the fact that Iran could not have a nuclear weapon, should not have a nuclear weapon, and of course we're engaged in a military action there as well. So Dr. Shariat, it's always good to have you on the program. I appreciate the great work that you are doing, and I encourage people to go to your website. We've got all the links in our newly updated website of pointofview.net. So thank you for being with us today here on Point of View.
Well, thank you so much, Brother Kerby. You're doing a great part, your mission to bring awareness to Americans, and you are perfect choice for the Lord to do this.
Well, thank you very much. Just before we go, let me mention that tomorrow is our Friday weekend edition. One of the other things you will find on our website, which of course so we've always had, is my daily commentary, which actually today is based on this new book by Gatsad. Dr. Gatsad has been on the program before. Matter of fact, I've heard from my producer, Steve Miller, who's going to try to get him on again. We talked about his previous book, but this newest one, Suicidal Empathy, Dying to Be Kind, is a good connection to that, because, for example, even in the latest PragerU video, he talks about how in Germany, the German Chancellor Angela Merkel brought an open-door policy, brought in all sorts of Muslim migrants who had no intention of assimilating into their host society. You can see the same thing as we just talked about in England and other places. And as a result, this is a classic illustration of what he calls suicidal empathy. Yes, empathy is a virtue, but unchecked, it can be a vice. When instead you shut off your rational mind and you no longer think through the implications of some of your political policies, you pay a price. So my commentary today is based really primarily on this very good PragerU video with Gat Saad. I've got the book. Actually just waiting so we could do an interview with him, because it is very concerning about the fact that if you want a flourishing of Western civilization, we need to end this suicidal empathy right this very day. So you can find all that on our website at pointofview.net. But first of all, let me thank Megan for her help engineering the program. Steve, thank you for producing the program. If you find yourself saying, I'd like to know a little bit more about some of the things Christopher Reese has written about, Hormoz Shariat has written about, some of the things we talked about in terms of the Iran war, or even our very good piece by Victor Davis Hanson about Stop Destroying Civilization, all available at the website pointofview.net. That's all we have for today. Look forward to seeing you tomorrow right here on Point of View.
Will the American experiment endure? As we approach the 250th anniversary for our nation, we must recognize the answer to that question largely depends on us. In 1789, President George Washington said something important. He said, "America is an experiment entrusted to the hands of the American people." That means that our actions, our values, determine the course of our nation. Washington also argued that we can't expect blessings if we ignore God's moral order. If you want to help the American experiment endure, if you want to restore the moral foundation that made this nation strong, partner with Point of View. Your support equips listeners to live according to God's moral order and defend freedom for the future. Give this month and your gift will be doubled. Call or click today at pointofview.net or call 1-800-347-5151. That's pointofview.net and 1-800-347-5151. Point of View is produced by Point of View Ministries.